Well, if I had to give a title to today's reading, I think I would call it The Rise and Fall of King Saul. Because in just a few chapters, he goes from being anointed and chosen by God to being rejected by God. He goes from being filled with the Spirit of God to being tormented by an evil spirit. Through the life of Saul, the Lord makes it clear that nobody, not the king or anybody else, is above God's commands. No matter how important your position is among the people of God, God alone is still God. Well, Saul got off to a pretty good start in chapter 11. The Ammonites were oppressing the people of Jabesh Gilead, and it says that the Spirit of the Lord came upon Saul, and he gathered his soldiers, and he went and he defeated the Ammonites. Then after that, some of Saul's people went to go and execute those who had earlier opposed the idea of Saul being king. But Saul turns their hearts towards God. He says, nobody is going to die today because the Lord has given us a great victory. In chapter 12, Samuel calls the people together and he publicly confirms Saul as their king. First, he reminds them that the reason they have a king is because they had rebelled and rejected God as their king. But then Samuel makes it clear that even though they have a king, the rules of the game haven't changed at all. Israel is still God's people, and even the king is under God's authority. And so the fate of Israel, Samuel says, will not be determined by the greatness of their king, but by whether or not the people and their king walk in the ways of the Lord. That's made very clear in what happens next, chapter 13. The Philistines gather a huge army to come against Israel, and Saul's soldiers are really afraid, so much that many of them run away. They're hiding in caves, they're hiding in cisterns, anywhere they can get away so that they aren't seen by the Philistines. Saul wants to seek the Lord's help in this battle, but Samuel had told Saul clearly that he was to wait for him for 7 days so that then he, as the Lord's priest and prophet, would come to offer the sacrifices to the Lord. But Saul panicked, and he took things into his own hands, and he offered the sacrifice himself. And that's not a small thing, because the Lord had made it so clear throughout the history of Israel that only the priests could offer the sacrifices. So Samuel arrives and he says, Saul, what are you doing? And Saul makes excuses. He says, what was I supposed to do? The Philistines are attacking, my soldiers are all running away, and you weren't here yet. I didn't have any choice. Samuel says, no, you did have a choice, and you chose not to keep the Lord's commands. He said, Saul, the Lord would have established your kingdom for you and for all of your descendants after you. But now the Lord has chosen someone else. He has found a man who will seek after the Lord's heart. Saul's foolishness continues in chapter 14. They're about to go to battle against the Philistines again. And Saul calls for the priest to bring the Ark of the Covenant so that he can seek the Lord. But then he decides he doesn't have time to go through doing that. And so he takes things into his own hands again. He makes a vow that he thinks will somehow have power and give them victory in battle. He says he will kill any soldier who eats anything until, and this is a clear indication of where Saul's heart had turned, until, he says, I have avenged myself of my enemies. Saul was no longer fighting for God's kingdom and God's glory. He was fighting for Saul's kingdom and for Saul's glory. Chapter 15, the Lord sends Saul to punish the Amalekites for their wickedness historically to Israel. And he tells him clearly not to leave anything alive, not people, not even the animals. But as usual, Saul did what he thought was best. He won the battle, but he took the king of the Amalekites alive as his prisoner rather than killing him. And he kept for himself all of the best of the Amalekites' sheep and cattle. Saul thought he could choose how to obey the Lord, that he could take God's commands and do it his way in order to accomplish his purposes. And Samuel says, Saul, you've disobeyed the Lord again. And Saul says, I did obey. I defeated the Amalekites just like the Lord told me to. But then the soldiers took the sheep and the cattle. But it's okay because we saved the best ones in order to sacrifice to the Lord. Saul thought that he could do what he wanted to do and disobey the Lord, and then that somehow the Lord would be pleased because he takes the results of his disobedience and offers them to the Lord in a supposed act of worship. And Samuel says, Saul, you have rejected the Lord's commands, and therefore the Lord has rejected you as king. Samuel makes it clear that whether you're the king, the bishop, the pastor, or anybody else, God alone is still God. And then he tells something to Saul that we all need to hear, that we all need to be reminded of often. He says to obey is better than sacrifice. The Lord didn't need a bunch of sheep and cattle, and he doesn't need our Sunday morning services or our Friday night prayers or our daily Bible reading. What he wanted then and what he wants now is the same. He simply wants his people to love him and to obey him with all their hearts.